Mayor and Council, we have a consulting attorney to walk us through the redistricting process, and I will have them come up now and introduce themselves and go through the presentation.
Good afternoon, council members, staff. My name is Gunnar Sequist, and I'm with the Bickerstaff Law Firm out of Austin, Texas, and we have been engaged to assist the city in the redistricting process in connection with the charter amendment that recently passed. Right now we're handing out a copy of the presentation. It will be up on the screen as well, but I'll make sure everybody gets one. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you guys a background, a little bit of background information on the redistricting process. I know some of you are familiar with the process and have been involved to some extent. Others may not have. But we'll talk about, as part of going about this process, what are some of the criteria and guidelines that the city can follow in drawing the 6 single-member districts, going from the 4 residential districts with 2 at-large council members to the 6 single-member council districts. And then we've set out a calendar, or a proposed calendar anyway. There's some flexibility built into it in which to try to go ahead and get this process completed so that elections can be held under the new system. One of the things that's important to bear in mind, there was a bit of a legal land shift a couple of years ago out of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. Prior to that case, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required any major changes or any changes, election changes adopted by governmental bodies to be pre-cleared through the Department of Justice. The Shelby County case took some of that pressure off and said that that process no longer applies. So in terms of the change in the election system here, whereas in past years you might have had to go to DOJ to have that pre-cleared before you could go through the process of formally adopting a change in the election system, that requirement is no longer in place. But while post-Shelby districting is less complicated because you no longer have to do the pre-clearance process, there are still provisions of the Voting Rights Act that do apply and that the city will have to take into account in conducting the drawing of districts as well as the adoption of districts, and that's what our firm is here to help guide the city through in that process. In particular, there are some basic legal principles that we always follow in redistricting. The first is the one person, one vote requirement. Also, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. There are strict restrictions on the use of race as a criteria in redistricting and in drawing districts. And then we will apply any applicable or counsel on any applicable state law election procedures or provisions as well as compliance with the city charter. In the city charter, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but a couple of the things I'll bring to your attention early in the process is the city charter calls for this process to be completed before the end of the year, and so we have a pretty aggressive schedule to get that done. The city charter also calls on us calls on the city to use 2010 census data as the primary data point for drawing the single-member districts. If there are certain circumstances in which the 2010 data is no longer accurate because of certain growth issues, we can also estimate population based on the 2010 census data, but I think for the most part in this case the city is going to be pretty safe. From our initial review, the city is going to be pretty safe relying on the 2010 census data because there does not appear to have been any major growth that would throw off those numbers in a significant way. talk a little bit first about the one person, one vote requirement. This requirement does apply to cities and single member districts. And basically what the crux of this is that ultimately the districts that you draw have to be roughly proportionate or equal in population. So there is a certain amount of variability that can be allowed, but what you're aiming for is drawing districts of equal population. It's not an absolute safe harbor, but the courts have told us that generally districts are determined to be constitutional if they have no more than a 10% deviation. This is perhaps more minutia than you need to know, but in terms of the actual calculation of the deviation, there is a specific manner in which we calculate that. We take the highest positive plus the highest negative, and that gives us what our ultimate maximum deviation is. And so this is just an example of how districts might be. They won't be precisely equal. There will be some variation, but ultimately they'll be well within the 10% deviation between them. As I mentioned with the one person, one vote, and also when it comes to looking at demographic allocation, the name of the game is population. You'll hear us talk about several different types of population. There is, of course, total population. That means everyone that's within the city limits. That comes from the census data. We'll also look for purposes of drawing districts, more particularly at voting age population, which are those individuals who are over the age of 18. We will also look at, in particular, in allocating demographics to particular districts, we look at citizen voting age population. That's ultimately the metrics the courts have told us to draw districts based upon. That information, so that's everyone who is over 18, who is also a U.S. citizen and thus eligible to vote. That comes from the American Community Surveys data. That's information that is put out by the census through surveys, 1- and 5-year surveys. And then we can also use the voter registration list and look for Spanish surname registered voters, which can also give us an approximation that we can use in conjunction with the citizen voting age population, or CVAP. And what we use that data for is not only to make sure that the districts, the single member districts, once they are drawn, are equal in population, sufficient to comply with the one person vote, one vote rule, but we also make sure that they are allocated in such a way that we are not running afoul of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is applicable nationwide, and it creates a cause of action for violation of electoral rights. And what Section 2 looks at is there discrimination in the adoption of an electoral process that has the effect of diminishing a protected class's ability, opportunity to participate in the political process or to elect candidates of their choice. Is there diminishment in that possibility or opportunity or possibility to elect? But as I mentioned before, Section 2 does not require preclearance. So we get this right on the front end, and that way if there's ever a challenge down the road, we will have evaluated the districts that are proposed and adopted from a standpoint of Section 2 to make sure the city is in the best position to not have a problem in the first place, but also to defend any challenge should there be any. One of the things we will look at in terms of Section 2, what you often hear about in the context of Section 2 in terms of the diminution of political opportunity or the ability to elect is vote dilution. And so frequently when you have a claim under the Voting Rights Act, what you have is somebody alleging that the electoral system adopted by the city diluted the power of their vote. That effectively happens in one of two ways, either by packing a particular district with a minority or protected class, or by cracking established communities of protected classes into separate districts so that you dilute their vote. So either by packing them into a district, causing their vote to be diluted that way, or by breaking them apart so they can't form an effective majority. This is just a visual representation of what that looks like. here what you have is cracking, basically allocating minorities across or protected classes across 3 districts in numbers small enough that they can't form an effective majority. Alternatively, packing, where you create one district that has a very high percentage of a protected category group, whereas leaving the other districts with such a small percentage that they don't have, so as to dilute their voting power. Cracking and packing, when we talk about those terms, are typically not prohibited except in regard to minority groups protected under the Voting Rights Act. As an aside, we're starting to see more cases that actually involve partisan cracking and packing as well. That's not going to be an issue here. Here, when we're talking about cracking and packing, we're going to be talking specifically in regards to minority groups that are protected under the Voting Rights Act. A little bit of the demographics. This is the current makeup with the 4 council districts. These are the 2010 census data, which had the city at approximately 139,824 in total population. It looks like from estimates and updated data that number has gone up to around the 143,000 in total population at this point. Again, some growth, but probably not enough to call into question the reliability of the 2010 census data in terms of its use for conducting the redistricting process. Of total population, it looks like the Hispanic or Latino population is about 31% of the population. Your African American population is around 22%, and then other populations are fairly small. So what we'll be looking at primarily when we try to make sure we're allocating in a way that doesn't crack or pack, or that and that comports with the Voting Rights Act, is making sure we focus on or we pay attention to the Hispanic population as well as the African American population here in the city. Importantly, under Shaw versus Reno, which is a United States Supreme Court case, what the Supreme Court has told us is when it comes to redistricting, we look at protected categories such as race, national origin, only insofar as it is necessary to make sure that we are following the Voting Rights Act. And so while we will look at those numbers to be sure that we are comporting with the federal law, we don't otherwise use them for any purpose as part of the redistricting. So what the court has said is you can't use race or national origin for any reason other than to make sure that you're comporting with the requirements of Section 2 and not diluting the votes of protected groups within the city. In the packets that we've given you guys, given the council today, we have a proposed timeline for the redistricting process. The first sort of blue triangle on the timeline there is this meeting. One of the things that you'll have before you today, I believe is on the agenda for the meeting following this one, is the adoption of the redistricting guidelines and criteria that we'll discuss in a moment. Once we've got those, once those have been adopted, another question for the council will be the best way to solicit input from council members in terms of some of the factual information that we need in regards to the city and some of your ideas and input. There are 2 ways that cities traditionally undertake that action. They can appoint a committee that can include either a smaller portion, less than a quorum of the council, or some cities have used citizen committees, or a combination of the 2. Or frequently what we will do is, as the attorney, myself and Sherry McCall, our GIS specialist, who is here with me today, will meet individually with council members just to gather some information, ask some questions, get some information that we can then take back to prepare some illustrative plans that we can then bring before the whole council for comment. It's really up to the individual city how they want to pursue that process. Frequently, the individual interviews are the quickest and most efficient ways to get that information. Sometimes committees can take longer and also end up kind of going through more derivations, but certainly we can do it either way at the preference of the council.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
You're talking about getting started as opposed to there, as I read through some of this before, we'll have public meetings down the road.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, because I want to be thinking this would be the only time the citizens would have a chance.
No.
You're simply talking about the beginning process.
That's right. Really the first step in the process is we get an illustrative plan to come before the council for the council to evaluate in a public meeting and approve for public comment. And then what we'll typically do is we will hold 1 or 2 public comment sessions where the public actually can come in, comment on the plan that the council, the illustrative plan that the council has selected as reflective of its wants and goals, and also have the opportunity, and this happens, for citizens to support their own plan, to submit, their own plans. If they have drawn one that they would like to see submitted and considered, we give the citizens an opportunity to do that as well. So not only do they get to review and comment upon the plans that the council approves, they will also have an opportunity to submit their own plans for the council's consideration as well. And so in looking at the time frame, in terms of the development of the illustrative plan, we would anticipate doing that, most likely in August is what we have it scheduled for. Have the council designate an illustrative plan for public review by about mid-September. Go ahead and gather public comment in 1 or more meetings over the October time frame, and then our firm will actually synthesize all of the public comment and put that together in a report for the council to consider, and then we will move towards having the council adopt its final redistricting plan in the November time frame. And then after that, our firm will work with the city in order to provide all the necessary materials to get the newly adopted districts information over to the Dallas County election system so that they can incorporate that in holding elections on a going forward basis. And once the districts are in place, we'll also assist in terms of actually holding the elections. Since you guys have gone to a uniform election date, we're going to have these in place a good time in front of the November 2019 elections. So there will be ample time for citizens to get an understanding of the new districts and for candidates to choose whether they want to file to run. When it comes down to the actual meat and bones, the mechanics of the drawing itself, we recommend the adoption of the redistricting criteria. That's the resolution that council will have before it this evening. There are some principles that the courts have told us are positive for consideration and that are appropriate criteria on which to draw districts in compliance with federal law. Where possible, use easily identifiable geographic boundaries, roads, established neighborhoods, those kinds of things. Facilitate practical voting precincts and adequate facilities for polling places. We will look at the voting precincts established and polling places, make sure we're not splitting precincts or putting folks where they're in inadequate facilities, although I don't expect that to be an issue. We've also got the one vote, one person requirement. We will be making sure that the districts are configured equally based on the 2010 census data and not in excess of the deviation of 10%. The courts have said that it is okay to consider incumbent constituency relationships and historical representation, so we will be looking at, as part of this process, where the incumbent council members currently live, what their districts look like, in order to incorporate that into the map and let the council consider that as well.
Could you expand a little bit about maybe what the courts have said is positive? In my mind, I'm seeing a lot of cons for that particular item. So I guess why?
Which
I guess I wrote down as F, but I think that's on our resolution. The bullet point you just went over.
in terms of considering incumbent, the Supreme Court has said that it is a reasonable use of political political status to consider where incumbents are. You have communities that have an affiliation, a connection with their elected representatives, and so you can consider that in terms of drawing a district. We don't have to.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So if we strike F from our resolution, we're not out of compliance with?
Not at all. That's
Supreme Court cases.
an ability that the city has.
Okay.
Some cities use it, and some say, we don't want you to think about that at all. Just go draw us the best districts you can, and don't worry about where the incumbents are.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. We will design compact and contiguous districts to the best of our ability. I mean, we don't want a bunch of districts that are ill-shapen and not compact, so we'll make sure that the maps are compact and contiguous districts. We will narrowly tailor the plan to address voting rights considerations. What that means is essentially we don't use race or national origin other than to make sure that we are complying with the Voting Rights Act. We don't avoid fragmenting any geographically compact or packing. That's basically the same thing. We're not going to crack or pack voters to the best of our ability. We've also got here some guidelines in terms of citizen proposed plans. And this basically just makes sure that we're making an apples-to-apples comparison between the plan that the city designates as the illustrative, or that the council designates as the illustrative plan, and any plans that citizens might submit of their own accord. This way, they all meet a certain set of criteria and they can be compared equally. And so the steps, as we go through this, as I mentioned, we're going to assist you in drawing an illustrative plan for the comments, consideration, and designation. And that the purpose of that illustrative plan is to present it to the public for public comment. We will conduct or present or assist in the presentation of that plan at public meetings so that the public actually has an opportunity to comment or submit alternate plans. We will perform an analysis of that, providing a report to the City Council. And if at that point, based on public comment or other additional information or feedback, it's appropriate to revise the plan at that point, we'll help you guys revise the plan at that point to where it's in a final form, and then aid you in the adoption of the final plan, and notify and coordinate with Dallas and Kaufman County so that the elections can move forward starting in November of 2019. And again, these are the timeframes. I think we have generally talked about them, but ultimately, the basic timeframe that we've set out, and again, depending on the city's schedule, if the council has a particularly heavy agenda at any of these times, we're flexible on these items. We can move around. But the basic plan is to have a designated illustrative plan here by the end of the summer, early fall, or mid-fall, and then begin the public input process over October, finalize the plan, and have the plan adopted by November, although we can run into December if we need to. The only requirement under the charter is that we do need to make sure the city has the new plans adopted before the new year. Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you. I'm sure we'll have a few. Let's go back just so we kind of clear too. On this beginning, in the early stages, you're really kind of wanting to get a feel from the council of what we think this process will be and all. So you mentioned one-on-one meetings. Are those typically, can they be conducted by phone, or are they in person, or how do you?
We'd probably do it in person. It just works better that way. Sherry and I would come up. We'd pick a day or two over which to conduct those interviews. And basically the important part is to learn some of the essential elements and functions of the communities that you represent. I mean, there are things that you guys know about those, obviously, that out-of-town lawyers don't. And so to get that information firsthand from you is helpful and essential to the process.
Is that something you guys are willing to do? What would be sometime in August, September, I'd assume?
That's correct.
Mayor, I was just going to kind of object a little bit. I would rather us do it in a pre-meeting or in a committee that's public, and all the comments are captured publicly, rather than doing individual meetings, gathering information one-on-one from people who have a vested interest in how the map is drawn.
I appreciate
Good
that.
potential.
Sure. Well, I understand that. And I'm trying to just kind of, that's why I'm asking the questions and trying to cover this right now, because I'm trying to get a feel for, you said something a little bit different there than you did earlier, which was a feel for the districts and the people and the city and the town, not necessarily, I want it drawn on Beltline and Galloway, or, I mean.
No, that's correct. And it is a purely fact gathering. We are not going to be discussing how the district should be drawn. We are going to be discussing, where are, for example, in the areas that you currently represent or within the city, where are the communities of interests that we don't want to split? Where are the parks, that are important to a particular community? Where are the city resources that are important to a particular community, so that we have an understanding of where those items are, so that when we prepare the illustrative plan, we're able to incorporate that and then take comments on, well, you've got this line right here, we'd like to see it over here, those kinds of things in a public setting.
Okay. Does that make sense?
It's fair enough. I would just rather do it either as a committee, pre-meeting, post-meeting, where we are capturing that information and it's transparent.
I understand. I mean, and we can record them, or I think, for me, one-on-one's probably just as easy. You're a little more free to speak and say what you want to say, but I completely understand what you're talking about in terms of a meeting. So now we have lots of people to weigh in.
No,
Go ahead.
I would agree with that. I would agree with you, Mayor. One-on-one, spending time and going with someone, even going with someone out into the district itself and seeing the different areas. But then later it'd be opened up for comments from the public, from the community, in regards to what we're looking at in redistricting.
That's correct, and I think it's important to bear in mind that the actual deliberation on the plan itself will all be in a public meeting.
Right.
No, I appreciate that. I think the concern sounds like it would be, discussions would be made in private and that words would be said that the public wouldn't be able to hear. I don't have any objection with having one-on-one meetings, but to allay any suspicions or fears of Councilman Casper, let's tape them all. Let's videotape every single word that's said, every meeting of all of us. I don't have anything to hide, and I don't have anything to worry about, and I don't think the rest of us do either. So to allay Councilman Casper's concern, I say tape it all.
That's one. That is one option. Again, it is an attorney-client meeting, so there is potentially some concern there. I think if there is a particular concern about the transparency or visibility, then maybe the better option for this particular council would be to look at forming a council committee. That would probably be more advisable over recording individual sessions, would be my thought.
Yeah, but then you get into 3 people versus you won't do 4, because if it's 4, it's like you said, it's a quorum, and I think we could probably accomplish both. I mean, I know it's very well said and very well taken. I think for me the process, other than just these initial meetings, will all be public, and that's where I'm where I'm thinking if you want to say one-on-one, and I appreciate your comments.
Mayor, and I just want to get some clarification. A fact-finding mission from us about, could you restate where parks are? I think we could do that with a map. So help me better understand the fact-finding mission of these one-on-one meetings.
I think it is, the purpose of the purpose of the one-on-one meetings is to give us some insight to the facts on the ground here in Mesquite, about the different communities that are present, about the interests of those particular communities, about, these are the kinds of things.
And I guess that's where some of my concerns are. The analytics are the analytics, the demographics, the geography, and I guess when we start talking about the interests of different communities, now we are moving into a political sense, and I'd be much happier if we were establishing a committee of 3 that met before or after a council meeting, rather than doing one-on-one and having political conversations.
Yeah. Mr. Archer?
I was just going to say, Mayor, I'm comfortable with your thought process. I think there will be enough public deliberations on this that perhaps having some individual conversations with each of us wouldn't be a bad thing to have good clarification, good information for this this group to come back with a helpful process. I'd be okay with that.
Mr. Noche, we're just discussing the initial meetings, whether we do it on one-on-one, and Councilman Kesper's talking about really he feels more comfortable with the committee. We're just kind of talking back and forth on that. It's just a preliminary that I wanted to bring you up to speed. Where we're the first time that they sat down with us as a one-on-one basis.
And to flesh that out, I know we're having many different meetings, and an extensive portion of it will be public. I just am not convinced that there are any special facts that we as political individuals are going to enlighten this process with.
I appreciate it. Yep, one way or the other, don't care. I don't know if you thought about or weigh in on this one way or the other, Mr. Noche. Whether we did an individual meeting or whether we're looking at, we would form a 3-member committee. The only challenge of that is we have 4 current districts, and so we would try to, I guess we'd have to have somebody that, I don't know how you'd put the 3-member committee that represents all 4 districts. You can do it in a work session in an open meeting here.
Just have the whole of the Senate.
Yeah.
And do a pre-meeting.
And that is, if the council wants to do this process in a work session, in an open meeting, we've done that too, and we can do that as well. It's really the preference of the council.
The reason I bring this up is we also, as one of our charter referendum items, did term limits, right? And so we have some individuals on here who are motivated that we also didn't reset that, right? That we shouldn't be kind of judges in our own cases. And I just want to make sure we're doing the same consideration with something that's going to last for the next 10 years.
Mr. Noche? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I like the work session idea. I also like the committee idea, the individual. I think that there are various motivations. So I'm the only council member who's not affected, or who is affected by term limits. So certainly would advocate to be on that committee if it goes to the three-person committee. But I think that the work session or the committee would be the best mechanism.
We can do that I've been told by the city manager on the 20th and just do it in a pre-meeting.
I'm for the work session, too.
Okay. We'll do a work session.
Work session.
That's why we made these conversations.
Sure.
To consensus where we need to go. What else do we have? Any other questions on this process? Anything anybody have?
No, I just was going to express my discomfort with item F. Well, I guess that's back to consent agenda. Yeah, because it's on there.
It's
From our
on
resolution.
resolution. We can, and we can discuss that on the agenda discussion. That's fine. Anything on the process? I mean, I think I don't know that has anyone been through redistricting before?
No, it's something I teach in my geography class and my government class, and it's a lot of fun. And I was just going to ask you, if I had my students draw some maps, when would they need to get those in?
That would be for the public comment, public hearing process.
November?
That's right.
Great.
October, November.
October, November. Getting ready for the fall. We appreciate you being here today and setting this out and timelines. I was looking at some of this, and I don't want to need clarification today, where it talks about how, at the end of next year, the deadline to adopt the plan is after the election. I thought that was right before the election, I guess, which seemed a little interesting on your printout on the timeline. That 20. Oh, I see. It's just the dots lined up in November. But we'd actually, to your point, what are we actually adopting this year versus what's on this timeline for next year?
What we are adopting this year is the actual districts. We're going to draw the districts. The council's going to debate those. Public's going to have input, and then we're going to get a final plan for the council to formally adopt, and those will be the districts that are used in the next election cycle.
So what's the deadline in September on here for? Of next year. It's on this form that just says 2019. It says adopt the plan September 2019.
That's a deadline. We're ahead of the game. That's a deadline under the election code.
Legal. Gotcha.
For that you would have to do that by. But under the charter here, we're well in advance of that. So you won't, that's just a reference point for you.
It's printed on a sheet of paper. I want to make sure I know
Yes,
what
sir.
it meant.
Yes, sir.
All right.
I apologize for any
No,
confusion
no.
about that.
I'm trying to make sure I know what it is we're doing.
Certainly.
Councilman Archer? Oh, I thought your light was on. I'm sorry. I'm looking for the green lights. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very
Look
much.
forward to working with you.
Likewise. We appreciate you guys allowing us to assist the city in this very important project. It's our honor.